Enter into a realm of fright, blacker than the darkest night. Your sanity hangs by a thread. Welcome to the House of Dread. Have you ever had to confront a paralyzing fear or phobia? That one thing that sends shivers down your spine and leaves you feeling utterly helpless? It's a terrifying experience, isn't it? The kind that makes your heart race and your palms sweat uncontrollably. What happens when you're forced to face your fear head on? Does it help you to conquer it? Or does it only intensify the terror? Enter Steve. A construction worker standing tall at an impressive height of 6 feet and 4 inches. Steve was well built with a stout and muscular physique that exuded a presence of strength and power. Not only did Steve possess physical prowess, but he also had a fiery temper that was known to ignite at the slightest provocation. A no-nonsense kind of guy, Steve refused to take crap from anybody. As a result of his imposing stature and aggressive demeanor, people often found themselves feeling intimidated in his presence. Despite all of this, Steve struggled with a particular insecurity. He had a paralyzing fear of statues, particularly wax statues. Yes, those seemingly harmless figures that mimic the human form, frozen in time with their eerie, lifelike features. For Steve, they were the embodiment of his darkest nightmares. As a child, Steve suffered a very traumatic experience that marked the beginning of his phobia. As a young boy, Steve's parents took him to an amusement park where he unintentionally got separated from them. In his desperate search for his parents, Steve found himself surrounded by eerie mannequins and unsettling statues. This intensified Steve's fear and left him completely paralyzed with terror. Although his parents did eventually locate him, the traumatic experience had a lasting impact on Steve from which he never fully recovered. As an adult, Steve's struggle with his phobia of statues, particularly the lifelike wax statues, had become a constant battle. Walking through the crowded streets, Steve would go out of his way to avoid stores with mannequins on display. Their blank, lifeless eyes seemed to follow him, taunting him with their frozen expressions. He would cross the street or take a longer route just to steer clear of these unsettling figures. The mere sight of them made his heart race and his palms sweat. Any human lifelike figure, whether it was a statue in a park or a sculpture in an art gallery, sent shivers down Steve's spine. As a fully grown adult, he couldn't explain why these inanimate objects continued to have such a hold over him, but their presence filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Steve's phobia brought with it a deep sense of shame. He knew his fear was irrational, and this only intensified his feelings of self-disgust. He couldn't understand why he couldn't just get over it and be like everyone else. He felt weak and vulnerable, constantly worried that people would discover his secret and judge him for it. Nevertheless, Steve went about his life, trying his best every day to conceal his embarrassing little secret, pretending to be just like everyone else. One day, the construction company Steve worked for secured a contract to renovate an old historic building that was being turned into a museum. This was right on time as both Steve and his construction company were beginning to struggle financially. Steve was excited about the opportunity to work on such a prestigious project, and he threw himself into the work. Steve and his crew started with gutting and rehabbing the interior of the building, demolishing and rebuilding the floors, walls, and ceilings. Eventually, the construction team started their renovations in the basement of the old building. Deep beneath the decaying floors, the basement was a nightmare unto itself. The creaking stairs seemingly led to an alternate universe filled with despair and dread. Massive cobwebs stretched across every corner, forcing Steve and his crew to use their flashlights to knock them down as they struggled to navigate the pitch blackness. The walls themselves were a testament to the many years of neglect and decay. Rainwater leaking through the cracked foundation caused mold and mildew to spread across the once beautiful white paint, forming grotesque patterns that looked like squirming, pulsating veins on the decaying flesh of a long-forgotten corpse. A foul stench permeated the air that was nothing short of putrid, a cocktail of rotting wood, stagnant water, and decaying matter viciously assaulted the senses of Steve and his crew, making them gag involuntarily. The stench saturated their clothes and filled their nostrils, making the men feel as if they were going to regurgitate. Giant cockroaches scurried across the damp floor, their shiny exoskeletons glowing in Steve's flashlight. The basement was a twisted chamber of horrors, but the creepy discoveries had only just begun. Cautiously, the construction crew trudged through the dank and crumbling basement, their footsteps echoing off the moldy and mildewed walls. Suddenly, as they turned a corner, one of Steve's co-workers discovered what appeared to be the door to a hidden room. This was confusing to the men, as their boss had failed to mention that there were any rooms in the basement at all. Nevertheless, there it was, and it looked as if it hadn't been opened in years. One of Steve's co-workers slowly approached the door and began turning the knob to see if the door was locked. Surprisingly, it wasn't. A giant plume of dust billowed out from the frame as the door slowly opened with a haunting creak. As the men shined their flashlights into the dark abyss, they discovered something quite peculiar. Covered in dusty white sheets, a row of 12 imposing objects stood silently against the damp wall. The men were all totally stunned. There wasn't supposed to be anything down here. With a mixture of curiosity and caution, Steve and his crew reluctantly approached the objects, their footsteps slow and hesitant. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unsettling silence. Steve's co-worker extended his arm in an effort to remove the sheet from the nearest object, while Steve himself began to slowly drift to the back of the group. He wasn't too thrilled about being the first to uncover what lay beneath the dusty white sheets. Little did Steve know that in just a few moments, his fear would be justified. In an effort to quickly put an end to the anxiety the men were all feeling by this point, Steve's co-worker yanked the sheet off the first figure, clouds of dust circulating in the air as the men jolted backwards in astonishment. The sheet fell to the ground, and Steve's breath was caught in his throat. Standing before the men was an old, creepy wax dummy. its lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. The figure's features were frozen in a hauntingly realistic expression, as if it had been plucked from the very depths of a dark nightmare. The very sight of the wax dummy sent a shiver down Steve's spine, as he could sense his phobia resurfacing with a vengeance. He could feel his palms growing sweaty as his hands trembled uncontrollably. Steve fought like hell to appear stoic and unfazed. The last thing he wanted was for his co-workers to find out just how terrified he actually was. The men continued meticulously uncovering the remaining objects, only to discover that all 12 of them were wax statues. By far, this was the most disturbing discovery they'd ever made on any of their job sites. The men were utterly creeped out and totally bewildered as they grappled with an overwhelming myriad of unanswered questions. Who in the world had left these creepy wax dummies hidden deep within the confines of the basement? And more importantly, why? Was their boss even aware of the unsettling wax figures? And if so, why hadn't he told them? The men's minds raced with thoughts and theories, but no logical explanation could be found. Steve and his crew were also confused as they struggled to understand who the wax dummies were supposed to represent. These eerie figures certainly bore no resemblance to any famous or historical people that they were familiar with. The lack of logic in the situation only elevated the creep factor, and poor Steve was pissing his pants, although he struggled immensely to hide his terror. Soon after their shocking discovery, Steve and his crew proceeded to confront their supervisor, and were absolutely amazed that he had no knowledge of the wax statues. In fact, their boss seemed completely oblivious and merely scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. The men exchanged bewildered glances with each other, unable to comprehend how their boss could be unaware of such a disturbing presence in their workplace. In an attempt to validate their claims, Steve and his crew led their boss to the room where the wax dummies stood, frozen in their unsettling poses. Their boss's eyes widened as he gazed upon the eerie figures. It was evident that now he was just as disturbed as all the rest of them. After a moment of silence, their boss instructed them to proceed with the renovations as planned. At least, for now, they would temporarily work around the statues until they could figure out a way to deal with them directly. Although the boss's words were calm and composed, there was an underlying tension in his voice, hinting at his own unease. But eventually the men did return to their work and soon forgot all about the wax dummies. All the men except for Steve. As the renovations continued, Steve found it increasingly difficult to focus on his work. Haunted by that traumatic experience at the amusement park when he was only a boy, Steve found himself constantly peeking into the back room, checking to make sure the wax dummies were still there. Steve found it ever so frustrating that even though the damn things scared the hell out of him, he was oddly drawn to them. Every time he peered into the pitch-black room, the distorted figures and hauntingly lifelike appearances of the dummies caused Steve to shudder. These things were the stuff that nightmares were made of, and poor Steve felt as if whoever created these ugly statues did so with the sole purpose and sadistic intention of tormenting him. But Steve was done living in fear. He was tired of allowing this irrational phobia to control his life. Steve decided he was going to put an end to this once and for all. During one of his routine visits to the back room, he resolved to confront his fear head-on. With a burst of determination, he forcefully swung the door open and boldly entered the room, puffing out his chest like a fearless war general leading his troops into battle. Armed with a flashlight, he aggressively approached the first wax statue and looked it dead in the eyes. It was as if he was challenging it to make a move. Unfazed, Steve proceeded to the second and then the third statue, all while maintaining his confident stance and squared shoulders. He looked each of the wax dummies in the eyes and laughed. What a joke. Steve was big and strong, standing 6'4" and built like a tank. What could these stupid statues possibly do to him? Suddenly, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut behind Steve, trapping him inside the room with the wax dummies. The only source of light was his flashlight, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Panic immediately set in as Steve frantically twisted the knob and pounded on the door, his screams echoing through the silence. Each agonizing second felt like an eternity, while Steve's heart felt as if it was going to burst out of his chest. As Steve desperately tried to escape, his mind began playing horrible tricks on him, as he started imagining the wax dummies slowly beginning to creep up behind him in the darkness. As he imagined them inching closer and closer, the terror became unbearable, pushing Steve to the brink of a heart attack. Just when he couldn't take it anymore, the door violently flew open and Steve stumbled backward onto the ground. Completely scared out of his mind, Steve was shocked and disgusted to find out that his terrifying ordeal was nothing more than a cruel prank orchestrated by his co-workers. Turns out, they thought it would be fun to lock Steve in the room with the wax dummies, since he seemed to be so fascinated with them. Normally, Steve would have been ready to open a can of whoop-ass, but he was still struggling to catch his breath. As his co-workers laughed hysterically, Steve could feel himself internally regressing to that scared little boy who lost his parents in the amusement park. Flushed with shame and embarrassment, Steve bolted out of the room, shot up the stairs out of the basement like a bat out of hell, and left the job site without saying a word to anyone. The next day, when Steve returned to work, he was cold and distant. His co-workers attempted to apologize for playing such a cruel joke on him the previous day, but Steve was unreceptive to their efforts to make amends. He was pissed and irritated, and he wanted nothing more than to get this damn project over with. So he kept his head down, spoke as few words as possible, and immersed himself in his work. As the days turned into weeks, Steve continued focusing on his work. Since the day his co-workers had played that cruel joke on him, Steve had never revisited the room that contained the wax dummies. In fact, he was trying his best to forget that they were even down there. But both Steve and his co-workers knew that it would only be a matter of time before they would be forced to deal with the wax statues, if they were ever going to fulfill their contract and complete the renovation in a timely fashion. By now, Steve's supervisor had made countless phone calls trying to get any leads on who could have left those horrifying statues in the basement of the building. But strange enough, nobody knew anything. It was as if the statues had just manifested out of thin air. So, with no one to claim the creepy wax dummies, Steve's boss decided that if no one came to retrieve them in the next few days, he would simply have Steve and his crew toss them in their construction dumpster. And so the men went about their work, painting, putting up drywall, installing light fixtures, and laying down the new flooring. The work was tedious, but things were starting to come together. Steve pulled out his cell phone and began taking pictures of their progress, Part of his job was to take before and after shots to show to their clients. As Steve was taking his pictures, his boss walked up and asked to speak to him privately. Steve politely said yes as he placed his phone on a nearby table while his boss escorted him upstairs. As they stood in the hallway upstairs away from the noise of the construction, Steve's boss informed him that he had heard about the prank that Steve's co-workers had pulled on him, and he wanted to address the situation. At first, Steve thought he was in trouble for having left the job site so abruptly, but instead Steve's boss merely wanted to offer his support, and Steve could see the genuine concern in his boss's eyes. His boss went on to tell him that he probably would have gone home too if someone had did that to him. Steve felt a sense of relief knowing that his boss was aware of the incident and was ready to offer support. In fact, Steve's boss told him that he had a zero-tolerance policy for harassment on the job in any fashion, and that if Steve ever had any other problems, to come to him immediately. Steve felt a heavy weight lift off his shoulders, and he was totally taken aback by his boss's sense of empathy and reassurance. He realized that he had someone in his corner, someone who understood his side, and that made Steve feel a renewed sense of confidence and self-empowerment. Finally, it was the end of the day. The men were all exhausted, and all they wanted was to grab some beer and head home. It had been days since Steve's boss last spoke to anyone about the wax statues, and still no one had come to claim them. By now, the men had decided they would rest up and start fresh the following day by disposing of the wax dummies. Feeling a bit more upbeat and positive, Steve offered to treat his boss and co-workers to a round of drinks. Naturally, they took him up on his offer as they packed up their tools and prepared to meet up at the local bar. Steve told everyone to go ahead and that he would meet them there shortly. As Steve packed up his tools and cleaned up his workspace, he felt like he was finally getting back to himself. Since the prank with the statues, Steve had shut down, but now he felt like he was starting to come alive again. He recalled the conversation he'd had with his boss and how it made him feel understood and appreciated. In fact, Steve realized that it was the first time in his life anyone had ever really taken the time to listen to him. Beneath his rugged and aggressive exterior, Steve was a regular human being just like everyone else. And for the first time in his life, he felt like someone could finally see that. With his tool case in hand, Steve made his way up the stairs, down the hall, and out of the building. By now it was dark outside, and his truck was the only vehicle left in the parking lot. Steve tossed his tool case into the bed of his truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and shut the door. But just as he was about to start the engine, he remembered that he left his cell phone in the basement. Earlier that day, when he was taking pictures and his boss asked to speak to him, Steve had laid his phone down on a small table and forgot to put it back in his pocket. Well, he certainly wasn't about to leave without his phone. What if he needed to contact somebody? What if somebody needed to contact him? He had no choice but to go get it. Steve let out a frustrated sigh, climbed out of his truck, and proceeded to head back into the building. Steve turned on his flashlight and descended down the stairs into the pitch-black basement. He didn't even bother turning on any of their work lamps, as he figured he would only be down there for a few seconds, just long enough to retrieve his phone, and then he'd be getting out of there. Steve's flashlight illuminated a small work table located in the rear of the basement, sitting directly across from the room where the wax statues were kept. Steve made his way over to the table and picked up his phone. He immediately noticed a text message from his co-workers confirming that they were at the bar and that they were wondering where he was. He replied back saying that he was on his way, and then he slipped his phone into his pocket. Steve turned around and began walking towards the stairway, but he didn't even make it 20 feet before he heard a loud crashing noise echoing from the secret room that contained the wax dummies. Steve froze in absolute terror. He immediately whipped around, shining his flashlight directly on the door of the room, watching it closely like a hawk. Steve called out, asking who was there, but of course, he got no response. Steve stood frozen in the dark, totally terrified. He wanted to bolt up the stairs, but he couldn't get his legs to move. Then, his fear turned into anger as he began to assume that it must be one of his co-workers playing tricks on him again. Steve was red hot, and he began angrily shouting and demanding that whoever was on the other side of that door come out and reveal themselves. That was a mistake. Steve watched in horror as the door to the room began to slowly creak open. A pair of pale, gangly hands with long, wiry fingers emerged from the darkness. An emaciated figure now stood before him, with cold, sunken eyes that were filled with pure evil. Its body was twisting and contorting with freakish movements that were straight out of a nightmare. This was no joke. This was no prank. It was Steve's greatest fear manifested before his eyes. The wax statue was alive. Suddenly, all 12 of the creepy wax figures were pouring out of the room like a horde of flesh-eating zombies. Their grunts and groans echoed through the basement like a haunting chorus of dead souls. Steve's legs found new life as he bolted for the stairway, but as he tried to make his escape, he tripped on a pile of tangled extension cords, tumbling to the floor and twisting his ankle. As he struggled to get back up, Steve could see the wax dummies were closing the distance. Their terrifyingly contorted faces were twisted into expressions of pure rage. Steve was now hopping on his one good leg as he tried his best to make it to the stairway. But to his utter shock and horror, he found 4 of the 12 wax statues were waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. How could that be? How did they manage to beat him to the stairway? Steve was now surrounded by the horde of creepy wax dummies. Their arms were outstretched and their hands were reaching for him like the branches of a twisted tree. Steve began swinging at the dummies, trying to fight them off, but his twisted ankle prevented him from maintaining his balance, and he fell to the floor as the statues began to close in on him. Lying flat on his back, unable to move and with nowhere to go, all Steve could do was torturously watch his demise unfold in agonizingly slow motion. His eyes were wide with terror as he flashed back to that fateful night at the amusement park when he was just a boy. That same feeling of powerlessness he felt all those years ago had now returned and been amplified times 10. Steve's last-ditch efforts to escape proved fruitless, as the wax dummies finally closed in and Steve said goodnight. The next morning, Steve's boss and co-workers were eagerly anticipating his arrival at work. They were irritated that he never showed up at the bar to pay for their drinks like he said he would. But after waiting around for some time, the men decided they would just go on and start the workday without him. Like they all had agreed upon the day before, they decided they would start their shift by trashing the collection of wax dummies in the back room of the basement. As the men entered the room, to their surprise, the statues appeared before them, shrouded in the very same pristine white sheets that had covered them when they were first discovered. Now, none of the men could remember ever having put the sheets back over the statues, and they started looking around and asking each other who did it. Finally, the men decided it didn't matter, and they began pulling off the sheets in preparation to toss the statues into their construction dumpster. As they began uncovering each of the statues, one of the men noticed that there seemed to be an extra figure in the room. A 13th statue sat in the far corner, and it was the largest of all of them. This was unsettling to the men because none of them could remember a 13th statue, especially one as large as this one. Each of them swore there had only been 12. Suddenly, their boss entered the room, impatiently questioning the men as to why they were taking so long. The men directed their boss's attention to the tall 13th statue in the corner of the room and asked if he had seen it. Their boss began to slowly approach the large statue, marveling at its height and wondering where in the hell had it come from. The men stood in awe as their boss began to slowly remove the sheet from the towering figure. When the white sheet hit the floor, the men's jaws dropped in absolute terror. It was not just another wax statue. It was Steve, frozen in a state of eternal agony and fear. His eyes were wide open and his expression was frozen in a scream of horror. The wax dummies had transformed Steve into one of their own, forever trapping him in a world of cold, motionless torment. The men were shocked beyond belief, totally unable to understand how their friend had become a part of this twisted display. Steve's worst fears had become a horrifying reality, and he was now forever trapped in a nightmare that was impossible to escape. Always remember to confront your fears if you must, but do so with caution and respect. Understand the power that fear holds, and remember that sometimes it is far better to let sleeping demons lie than to awaken them in all their terrifying glory. If you enjoyed this presentation, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And if you're in need of a narrator for your next project, or you just want to say hello, contact me at thehouseofdread666@gmail.com. Until the next tale of terror, this is Victor Bloodborne. Stay dreadful.